Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session of the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. This is a marine-themed session. My name is Peter Davis. I'm facilitating this session, a little bit of a last-minute replacement, but delighted to be able to facilitate the session. Obviously, in my role as chair of the Wales Marine Action and Advisory Group, soon to be rebranded on Thursday as the Wales Coasts and Seas Partnership. So that's news coming through at the end of the week. But delighted you're able to join this session on the marine theme, where we've got three separate contributions to make. Take us through till about 3 o'clock. Just to remind you that you can ask questions through the live chat, and we'll try and pick those up through the session, and certainly follow up afterwards if there hasn't been time to pick up the points. You've got details of the presentations and the speakers' biographies on the website, so I'll not take up time by referring back to those. The sessions are being recorded and will be available afterwards. So really, without further ado from me, let me just go to Jake and introduce Jake Davis, who is going to take us through the experience in respect of the Sharks Inspiring Action Research with Communities. Really fascinating and important example of marine-based conservation work, working with communities, fishers and citizen scientists. I know Jake made a presentation to the Marine Action and Advisory Group a little while ago. Fascinating presentation, and really good to hear the update now. So welcome, Jake.
Thank you. I will just load up the shared screen now. So yeah, it's kind of going through Angel Shark Project Wales first, and then introducing the recent project, which is Project SIARC. So this should load up, and just let me know that it's there.
Yeah, you're good.
You're good. Cool. So yeah, I'm Jake Davis. I'm the project coordinator.
Can you just full screen it for us? Sorry, Jake. It's,
That's on full screen now.
If you stop sharing and share the window rather than, or share the actual slides rather than, at the moment you're just sharing the PowerPoint background.
That's because on mine it's gone loaded to the, I put on to presentation mode. It's on mine's the presentation mode now, so it's just a full screen.
All right, do you want me to, I'll share it at my end, and you just tell me when to skip the slides. Okay.
That's fine. I thought this. If I stop sharing, if you load now.
1 second.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. So yeah, I'm Jake Davis, the project coordinator for Angel Shark Project Wales, and more recently Project SIARC. So Angel Shark Project Wales still continues under the umbrella of Project SIARC, which is Sharks Inspiring Action and Research with Communities, which I will share more about later on. So I'll give an overview of Angel Shark Project Wales first, and recently, back in July, we had the first scientific paper published from the project to provide a better understanding of angel sharks off the Welsh coast over the last 4 years. So for a quick introduction of, should I go to the next one? I remembered I can't do it. Of what an angel shark is, not your usual shark. So this video here was finally last August. I was fortunate to go for a dive off a local dive site and been recording angel shark for the first time off the UK coast. For me, more exciting, it was off the Welsh coast, which was great. And just to be able to provide that footage was an amazing opportunity, and to see one underwater was something I thought I'd never be able to do. So I'm going to play the video. It kind of just shows what an angel shark looks like, what makes them so unique. I think it's, oh, I have to yeah, the play at the bottom. As you can see, they're not your typical shark, so they're a flat-bodied shark growing up to about 2.4 meters in length. They have really large pectoral fins, which they use to bury themselves under the sand or mud. The clip in a second will show them doing this technique that kind of flicks it over, and they've got a mucus layer on the top of their over their body, which allows this sand or mud to stick. And they lay in wait for prey, such as small gobies, to swim above. And they use this lightning fast jaw they've got that comes out to capture that prey. So yeah, very unique shark species. And the reason it is a shark and not a skating array is because the gills are finding at the side of its head. So we go into the next slide. Angel sharks were once found throughout the northeast Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and we're talking about Squatina squatina, which is the common angel shark. There are 3 other species found within this area, and over the last 50 years, this range where they found has declined. Press next slide, to areas which are highlighted here. The unique stronghold for angel sharks being in the Canary Islands, just off the west coast of Africa. There are spots of populations within the Mediterranean, around Croatia, Greece, and also not shown on the map, around Libya too. However, outside of those areas, the Wales is the potential next stronghold for angel sharks, where we've been working over the last 4 years to help better understand and get further evidence of angel sharks off the Welsh coast, which would be really exciting to show that there's actually every year we do get a few records of angel sharks. So if we move into the next slide, let's just highlight some of the projects that are within the wider angel shark conservation network that's ongoing and keeps on growing, which is great to help better understand the species within this region. So going on, and yeah, one more. So Angel Shark Project Wales, we initially started back as a pilot project back in June, or over the summer of June into August of 2017, where we worked closely with a few fishers based where I am up in North Wales on the Llyn Peninsula. And then finally in 2018, we got funding to launch Angel Shark Project Wales, thanks to the Welsh Government and Heritage Lottery Fund. And the project then has been carrying on, helping to better understand the species through a range of different ways of gathering data. But crucially for us, working very closely with fishers was the part, because they're out on the water every day and they're the ones who are most likely to encounter an angel shark. So moving on to the next slide. And after 3 years of that work, we kind of came up with an action plan which sets out the next 5 years plans and vision of how to have a thriving population of angel sharks in Wales. And this was done through working closely with a range of organisations across Wales, as well as the wider UK, from academic to government and NGOs too, to come up with these goals and actions, of which we are progressing slowly through, which is great. We'll move on to the next one. So the aim of Angel Shark Project Wales is to safeguard angel sharks in Wales through working closely with fishers, coastal communities, and using heritage, education and research. And moving on to the next slide, a key part of it was working very closely with fishers from the commercial, recreational and charter fishing sectors. And without the fishers, we wouldn't have any of the knowledge that we do today about angel sharks off the Welsh coast. And some of the photos that were provided through the project are incredibly insightful to angel sharks in the past. So going on to the next slide, we had over 2,200 records, of which 97% of these records were shared to us by fishers, and another 150 or so, 140 or so were gathered through different heritage, education, archival research or coastal community events where people brought in some photos or brought in memories of angel sharks off the Welsh coast. So each one of those photos provide us with a valuable piece of information about the biology of the shark too. I'm moving on to the next slide. Along with the fishers, we did carry out some novel events where we carried road shows back in 2019. These were held across Wales, which also was accompanied by a press release that ended up reaching around 40 million people globally, with news outlets from America and Australia getting in contact to find out more about how people can get involved with the project, or like to find out what we were doing with these road shows, because it was very specific, carrying road shows out across Wales for a single shark species. So over nearly 500 people attended, and we've got 135 additional records, of which some individuals brought in logbooks of their fishing, which provided some really amazing details about their fishing activity and when they encountered angel sharks during their activities too, along with loads of great stories of angel sharks in the past. And then on to the next few photos that came from the press, which gathered a lot of attention for these ones. And I think there's a few more photos to come up. There we go. And an example was a story from here in Swansea, when Graham brought in a photo which he had in his cupboard for nearly 30-40 years, unaware of what species he had caught that day. And he saw it on the news and then instantly recognised that and brought the photo to the roadshow to show us. And then it also helped him understand that actually he had been fortunate to encounter an angel shark in Swansea Bay that year. And it was just a remarkable story, and the fact that he wasn't aware about it and he wasn't sure what species it was until he saw this on the news that day, and he came down and met us in person and had a good chat and a coffee. And then to the next slide. And another unique way we did was to understand the history of angel sharks was we gathered a load of citizen scientists together and trained them in going through archives and libraries to uncover the past. And it definitely unlocked a lot more about the angel shark history than we all thought. There's lots of stories about how angel sharks are linked to heritage very closely due to their skin. Being a shark, they got really sandpaper-like skin. So in the past, they'd been used as sandpaper, as well as other community event stories, which I think if press next slide, may bring it up, and might not, but of an angel shark being caught in Barmouth, and the newspaper covered it in 4 different newspapers, and where this fisherman caught an angel shark, brought it to a shore, and they put a tent over it, and then the community started charging people to come into the tent and have a look at this strange shark, and money was then raised for the Red Cross, which was an incredible element, and we never thought that a shark would have almost that kind of a community link too, because it is such a unique looking shark. But it's kind of nice to know in the past that there is some kind of interesting community stories, and yeah, without these citizen scientists who scoured some of these places, we would never have known these stories and brought them to life and kind of giving more back to understanding links with sharks and different species and communities in the past. So on to the next slides. Here we go. That was the story. Along with a range of different names. So historically, many people know angel sharks as monkfish, not to be confused with what we now know as monkfish as anglerfish, which is a fish, whereas an angel shark is a shark. And that was due to their shape, looking more like a monk's cowl and with a gown on. But there's a few of the stories of why the angel sharks get their names. If you go to the next bit, the names varied from angelfish to fiddlefish, and then continues on a few more names to where in Welsh it is known as malgi. So on to the next bit, and I'll just show a few more names. Let's go into a few illustrations. If you just keep pressing through the slides, it will kind of just have a quick look at how angel sharks are being illustrated through the past. Here we go. And just continue with it. Just a lot of photos about how historically angel sharks were known as monkfish. Back in the drawings weren't so anatomically correct where they did the descriptions, but over time, as you can see, the drawings become pretty incredible, like that watercolor one there, or more specimens have been derived and been doing closer drawings, which definitely helped us understand how angel sharks were looked upon. So yeah, that was another part of the historic work that really helped us understand angel sharks along the Welsh coast itself. And then bring it together to the scientific paper that was released back in July 5th this year. It was accepted into the journal Fish Biology, and through the paper we brought all our findings together and we did some habitat suitability modelling of where angel sharks are likely to be found along the Welsh coast. But overall, we had 2,277 records dating back to 1812, of which some of these ranged in their confidence of 100% confidence angel shark ID and slightly less specific areas. But the data provided us with an insight that angel sharks were found almost across all parts of the Welsh coast, but places such as Cardigan Bay historically and still to this day being the place where we get the highest number of angel shark records. and then followed by the Bristol Channel area, and Swansea Bay being another historical place where angel sharks were caught more often, but not so much in recent years, with only 1 or 2 being in the last couple of years. Whereas Cardigan Bay, we've had a few, about 5+ every year for the last couple of years since starting the project. That's been really good to know that if one is caught, they are reported back to us. So the next slide. So this then just shows the number of angel shark records over that period of 1812 up into 2020, where the highest number of angel sharks can be found between 1970 and 1997. And if you press the slide again, there is a few factors that affect this, because it isn't representative of a population. It's a representation of the number of records that we've received, and these have a lot of variables that will change. For example, changes in fishing gear, changes in fishing areas, and changing fishing target species means that you're more or likely less to encounter an angel shark. For example, back in the 80s, when there was tangle netting as a form of fishing gear off the Welsh coast, was a lot more common compared to it is today, and they were targeting ray species. Therefore, you were more likely to pick up an angel shark. However, when there was a decline in the ray species in the mid-90s and into the 2000s, the number of records of angel sharks drop off along with the amount of rays were caught. Therefore, it doesn't tell us much about the population over that time, and we don't have numbers on the figure on the numbers of angel sharks off the Welsh coast. However, over the last few years, the number of angel sharks reported to us could be because we've been because of the establishing Angel Shark Project Wales, it's easier to share the records. And if with the rise of social media over the last 10 years, people share their information or share these photos of rare captures online and then are able to share them on to us, which means looks like there's an increase, but it's an increase of reporting angel sharks to us. So we still yet to have any numbers or estimates of what's happened with the population, but it provides an insight into what it was like in the past when there was higher fishing activity on gears likely to catch angel sharks. Moving on to the next slide. An overview, it just showed there in the top left corner, in A, that netting was the one where the highest reports of angel sharks came from. That was historically, not much netting now, along with charter fishing rod and line, where they were also targeting rays, so more likely to catch angel sharks whilst carrying that activity, whereas today a lot of the charter activities or fishing activities go offshore for taupe or onto reefs for taupe and black bream, so you're less likely to encounter angel sharks, which are found on the rougher gravel or sand ground. Interestingly for the angel shark biology though, the majority of individuals which were reported to us are adults, around 130 and 150 centimetres in length. So they're all large, mature adults. However, we also have records of juveniles and also recently born individuals that potentially show there's a breeding population of angel sharks off the Welsh coast. The video I showed earlier was actually of a juvenile or recently born shark, roughly 29 centimetres, which would have been born within the last couple of months of me seeing it. Further, for the number of records of angel sharks, the bottom graph just showed that the highest number come from between May and October. Also, that's kind of caveated with the fact that more fishing activity also takes place during May into October, where the winter months are less likely or less boats and fishing effort is going on. So, but overall, next slide will show there is historical anecdotal data from magazines such as Sea Angler, where there are reports of angel sharks moving in and out seasonally during the summer months, and when you're more likely to pick them up, which was really interesting data to accompany all the records that were shared with us. So if we go to the next slide. There we go, we're moving that one. Next one. And then quickly running through some other research elements. We've carried out eDNA sampling, so environmental DNA, where we took 2,000 millilitres of water from 10 sites each month to investigate angel shark seasonality. We did this back in 2020 over to 2021. And from these 10 sites, angel sharks were detected at all sites, but at different times of years as well. So they were actually all DNA was detected throughout the year as well, which was interesting to us, because it potentially shows that they are still present during the winter time all individuals may not take that offshore movement, but further analysis is being undertaken to better understand that movement. On to the next. Back in last year, we were fortunate to tag an individual. We had all the right permits and licenses to tag, as they are a protected species, and you aren't allowed to target them unless all this is in place. We were fortunate to go out with a fisher who knew the area and historically had caught angel sharks. And during the survey, we were fortunate to capture and tag an angel shark with a mini satellite pop-off tag. Unfortunately, this tag didn't pop off back in March when it was forecasted to do so. But it was there's still an ID tag, so if the shark is accidentally caught in future, we know where it was tagged. But it's an exciting moment that it was proof of methodology that this was possible to do off the Welsh coast. On to the next. As part of the education and community part, we also created resources for schools, Angels of Wales being an ebook, both bilingually in English and Welsh. If we go on to the next one, we then use the ebook as part of the online Meet the Scientist sessions too, which we carry out with schools. So it's an hour session providing information about the ebook, but also then providing a half-an-hour opportunity for school kids, 9 to 11-year-olds, to ask us questions about marine biology, the work we do with angel sharks off the Welsh coast, and the Welsh marine environment, which is a great opportunity, because I think it's really great that they have that opportunity to ask us these questions and engage with us, and have that conversations too, and showcase what we have off the Welsh coast. And then finally, for further outreach, we've been fortunate that angel sharks been portrayed quite a bit in the media. We've had a few opportunities from a range of TV programs to discuss different elements of the project. Of course, using Angwen, our 3D printed life-size angel shark, who we use for engagement and also for training in best practice in handling an angel shark if one is caught by accident, and how to safely release one back in the water. And that's been really great, just to be able to spread the awareness of the project, because every time we've done one of these opportunities, a angel shark record has come back to us too, and also providing people with an opportunity of how they can get involved with the project. So going on to more recently, Project SIARC, which is an evolution of Angel Shark Project Wales, which stands for Sharks Inspiring Action and Research with Communities. And moving on to the next slide, just an example of some of the work that's been done as part of this project, where we've been using baited remote underwater video systems, or acronymed as BRUVs, to kind of use it to gather information about the marine life of the sharks found off the Welsh coast, but also as an engagement tool to provide people with an insight of what it looks like below the waters around the coast. This was all taken within the Pysgota Special Area of Conservation. And they're just, yeah, such a variety of life that many weren't aware of. And also the visibility is much better than many of the days where you're out there too. If you want to move to the next one, that's kind of the final clip. And to next. So similarly to before, Angel Shark Project Wales, we are working closely with fishers and researchers and communities, but overall to collaborate and safeguard elasmobranchs and support a green recovery in Wales. A lot of our work focuses within two special areas of conservation, which were the Pysgota and also again the Carmarthen Bay and Estuaries area, and using BRUVs as part of this management of two SACs improved, gathering the data gaps there, where we're looking at species associated to the SAC features. Two features that we're mainly looking at are the reefs and the sandbanks. And there's a big DNI element, so diversity and inclusion element, so looking at opportunities for involvement in the marine conservation and diversifying this and understanding the barriers, potential barriers if there are any, and how to how to break those down. So all the work packages we're doing, such as citizen scientists or school engagement, have these diversity and inclusion areas. A wider appreciation of the underwater environment generated, and this is through different ways of media, schools, and what's saying earlier about the beta camera work. And then the next generation are inspired, and that's our big push on the school element, where we're doing 3D printing. So schools have been 10 schools in Carmarthen Bay areas, Carmarthen Bay and estuaries areas have been provided with 3D printers, so they can print their own shark on shark display and showcase that later in the year in an event that we'll be holding, where they all come together and showcase what they've created. Moving on to the next. So it's a fairly large project with a few delivery partners, along with the collaborative partners and some of the members of the wider Angel Shark Conservation Network too. And each delivery partner is delivering on different parts of the work packages. So on to the next. So just briefly, yeah, these are the two focus areas that we're working on. So one in the north, one in the south, and then on to the next one. So we've, rather than just focusing on angel sharks, we've expanded our focus species onto 4 benthopelagic, so species that live close to the bottom or on the sea floor. So angel shark being our kind of flagship species over the last few years, into spur dog just below, and then taupe, which is a more traditional sharky shark looking shark, and then the stingray, which catches many by surprise, but stingrays are present off the Welsh coast. The work we've been doing over the last few years has highlighted that every year there's 1 or 2 records of stingrays being caught either within the Cardigan Bay area or down in the Bristol Channel area, and using these species will help. These are also species that either are data deficient or listed as endangered or critically endangered on the IUCN list. So kind of better understanding these species too. On to the next one. There's only a couple of slides left. So we carry on doing our fisher engagement work. So we're working closely with fishers, carrying out semi-structured interviews to understand a lot more about the species, and but we'll also make sure that we continue regular feedback. So that's something I do quite often, is continue to go back and double check or have conversations about the species or anything that we've gathered, to make sure that information that is shared is correct and used in the right way. On to the next slide. So the beta remote's only being carried out in Penllyn a Sawnau. This year alone, we did 90 Bruvs deployments, so that's just over 100 hours worth of surveys carried out within the area. So these are working with charter boats around the area from Pwllheli, Barmouth and Abu Dhabi. So we're going out with them to kind of carry out this research. And the footage will then be uploaded to an online platform called Instant Wild, which is also run by Zoological Society of London. And this will allow citizen scientists to get involved and go through the footage and ID species that they've seen through this footage as well. So it's kind of providing that connection back to the marine life. On to the next one. I think that's near the end then. Just a quick clip off from what was shown before about what the bruvs look like. So there's some taupe that were filmed just off Pwllheli. You can go to the next slide if that's right. And with the eDNA, we're carrying on to do another year's worth of sampling. So every month, this time around the Carmarthen Bay and estuaries area. This is understand the seasonality, but also slightly different. We're doing a meta barcoding, which involves getting a suite of different species rather than just looking for one species within the water sampling. So that'll provide us with a lot more data of what species are present throughout the year within this Carmarthen Bay and estuaries area. On to the next. And then the opportunities, as mentioned before, we've got Instant Wild. There are opportunities to get involved with the North Wales Wildlife Trust, who ran egg case hunts through this summer, and then into the winter now we're going to be doing more archival research similar to before, but expanding to the other elasmobranch species. And then Occasionally, we're unfortunate that angel sharks washed up along the coast, but it provides us with an opportunity to better understand the biology of the species through working with the Cetaceans Stranding Investigation Programme. We've been able to carry out dissection events of these stranded individuals, 2 stranded last year, and we were able to pick them up. We did an event along with partners attending it earlier in the year in Aberystwyth, so we can gather data, but also engage to have the opportunity to see an angel shark in real life, which went really well. And then another one we did in Dublin. Unfortunately, 2 angel sharks were also stranded there, so we carried out a similar dissection over there with potential partners there. So we had some great opportunities to better understand and gather some really precious samples and DNA samples of these species. And then finally, it was school engagement, where we're continuing the ebook work, but with the Meet the Scientist session, and also the 3D printing, which, as you can see here, we 3D scanned the angel shark during one of the dissection events earlier in the year. So we now have the first 3D scan of an angel shark, which can be printed off by the schools if they wanted to. But the main point with the 3D printing is they can create their own display with their focal species and showcase the Welsh marine environment through their classwork. Perfect. No, and thank you for listening. If there's any questions, feel free.
Hey Jake, thanks so much for that. That's that's really inspiring. And I know there was the biodiversity deep dive report earlier today, and the importance of community-led engagement work was stressed in that process. And this is just an inspiring example, really, and a really practical example of how you can do that, and how through the sort of the use of that sort of inspiring example of a particular particular endangered species, which obviously has really captures imaginations, brings it all to life, and we've always said it's more of a challenge to do that in the marine environment in terms of engaging communities and schools in terms of the sea life off our shores. But your project is really doing that in a really special way. So that's excellent. I'm sure there's lots of learning out of it, which I think we'd be keen to pick up on in terms of that community engagement end of it, in terms of what lessons there may have been from the experience of trying to engage schools, engage communities, citizen scientists, the fishing community, which is really critical to the project and critical to marine conservation. So before we just move on, because I am conscious of time, but just sort of one question from me as chair: what are there learnings from that process that you could share?
Yeah, one of the big things is just continuous feedback and keeping the conversation going and making sure there's always that kind of not network, like communication. So that's the key part. So through every element of that, there's been feedback elements through events, so we kind of know what people enjoyed the most about. But also for the engagement part, it's just kind of being there if there's a call, or being able to just communicate quickly or have a phone call. So for fishers, I'm quite on the phone quite often. If there's something that comes up, we can have a chat about it as well. So it's kind of having that trusting relationship, and for schools, having the resource and having as much information as possible ready for the teachers has been a big part for us to understand how to get that learning element as part of the school curriculum or part of the lesson plan, really.
Yeah. No, I'm sure they're really key points, the trusted relationship bit, and also the resource capacity to support communities and schools in terms of making it easy for them to engage. So colleagues, if you've got further questions and points you want to feed into Jake, perhaps you can do that via the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. But just in terms of keeping to time, we probably now need to move on. So Jake, thanks really very much for that. That's really good stuff. So it's just going to move on now to introduce Rob Thompson from Odyssey Innovation, and many of you will be aware, but Odyssey Innovation and Rob have been leading work here in Wales and outside of Wales in terms of the circular economy and how marine plastic can be incorporated into a circular economy model. So Rob, great to have you with us, and I'll pass on to you for the next 25 minutes or so.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Like you said, I'm Rob from Odyssey Innovation, and we've been leading on a Welsh pilot project which ran for a year, looking at recycling the different types of fishing gear from different stakeholders throughout the coastline of Wales. So it's predominantly focused on end-of-life fishing gear, but we also did some work with charities to recycle beach clean plastic and any fishing gear that might have washed up on the shore as well along with that. I'm just going to open my slides up a minute so we can start. Share tray. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, so obviously the people in this conference are very aware of the marine litter crisis. One of the largest contributing factors seems to be poor waste management. And looking at some of the historical data as of 2015, the 6.9 billion tons of plastic that generated, only actually 9% of that was recycled. That's one of the key challenges. I started off working, running a charity, doing dive cleanups and recoveries, and quickly learned that there has to be preventative measures in place as well. Just recovering marine plastic is never going to be enough. And for me, one of the main things that could help on the prevention front is obviously looking at where this waste is going, making sure that it is being disposed of responsibly and that it is going into waste streams. So what we did was we set up originally the Marine Regeneration Scheme, which was originally just looking at the plastic that we were finding as a conservation group. We very quickly realized that actually to create any kind of circular economy model or to get it viably into recycling streams, you'd have to work on scale. So then we started working with other NGOs and charities and set up the Marine Regeneration Scheme. And then from that, we identified there was quite a lot of fishing gear in amongst the plastic that we were finding, and then started to look at specialist routes for recycling of fishing gear. And once we started that was an immediate sort of tipping point for us, that we had to start working on scale for one. And we went from looking at recovery to working on prevention. And we learned very quickly that the fishing industry was just under-resourced basically to dispose of fishing gear appropriately to get it into recycling streams. There was a lack of recycling routes and options for them, and one of the obstacles to waste disposal as a whole was the landfill charges. So some of the challenges what we faced are not just related to marine plastic, they are challenges faced by the entire recycling industry. Usually low volumes, mixed waste, the low value of those materials makes it very difficult to get those materials into recycling streams. And that's why things like the Welsh pilot project have been absolutely essential, to have that extra bit of support to take this material, which has less than no value at times, and try and figure out if it can be recycled, where it can be recycled, and then look at circular economy models that can potentially help increase the values of those materials. But to begin with, you really just need to get out there, get the material in, start processing that material and look at those routes. Quite often it's something which it can't really be done by desktop studies. There's a lot of assumptions involved, and to make it stack up economically, you need to have real data there of materials coming through and looking at those material values and the potential routes. So the instant challenge is sort of the inconsistent supply of materials potentially. You're working with lots of different types of materials, so some might be very low volume, some can be contaminated, you have remote locations. So they're all the most challenging elements normally of running a recycling scheme, and all of those elements involved in marine plastic and end-of-life fishing gear recycling. We're very keen from the outset that we should be trying to recycle as many different types of fishing gear as possible. Quite often when people think of fishing gear, instantly people just think of fishing nets, and that's not the case. Especially in the Welsh fleet, they've been moving further and further away, more onto static gear, pots, traps, etc. And being able to accommodate all the different types of fishing practices and all the different types of gear they use is important. I feel that when you start pulling those materials in as well, it can help increase volumes to make it viable to start recycling different fishing gear types. And we've also been using the work in the fishing industry to help support the work with the different charities and conservation groups that we work with, because obviously the volume of litter they're giving us to recycle is much, much lower again. So anything that can help increase those volumes helps increase those kind of recycling routes and helps make them more viable. So here's a bit of a flow chart that sort of demonstrates our methodology when it comes to what we can do with marine plastic and fishing gear as a whole. So obviously it starts with how potentially things can end up in the marine environment, and then you're really left with just the options of recovery, and you can see the various challenges that can be posed once things are lost in the environment. So you've got the challenge of ingestion and entanglement are the two main ones. Prevention wise, you've got harbour collections, so setting up port reception facilities for free recycling of any end of life gear is important on the prevention front. And then you've also got the recovery option. Any material from that goes into the net regeneration scheme, and from that we can gather valuable data that then can be used to help inform policy change, for one, to be able to sort of give that real-time data of the potential material flows that can come through from a recycling scheme. That helps sort of look at the potential true costs of running recycling schemes, and it could start identifying how those costs can be covered. So that can help inform different policy changes and potential different initiatives like extended producer responsibility schemes, those kind of things. Once it enters into the recycling scheme, there's the sort of product innovation, product design, looking at other businesses as well that can use your material through consultancy. Obviously that ties in completely responsible manufacturing, and there's a couple of big drivers for that at the moment. And the big ones are obviously looking at CO2 savings, but also trying to address marine plastic and the fact that we need to try and close the loop on that. We learned quite quickly, because we started off quite small scale and the concept was quite small. You know, we wanted to initially try and create a product of our own, working on quite small scale. It turned out that actually to have the impact that we need and to create the viable recycling routes, we need to work on quite large scale. So it went very quickly away from us just looking at what products we can create and looking at working with lots of different industries and businesses and collaborating with as many different stakeholders as we can and getting them interested in potentially using these materials as well, because that's what's going to safeguard the valuable part of our work, really. The innovation and the product design and all the rest of it is a sort of, it's very interesting to be involved in, but it's the actual recycling is the valuable part of what we do, really. And so the more stakeholders you can bring on board that have an interest in being able to use those materials and utilize them in the long run, obviously helps safeguard that and de-risks it, because if it was all tied in with one of our own innovations, if there was challenges faced around our own sort of products, then that would have a knock-on effect, which there has been during the COVID period, obviously with the lockdowns and everything else, that did slow up manufacturing of some of our products, etc. So working with other stakeholders, collaborating is sort of key to help create a sustainable sort of long-term scheme. And obviously one of the other benefits of once you're working with different stakeholders and they're creating those products is that's also driving further awareness, and that helps on the behavioural change front. You know, so the more people that are aware of the issues and aware of the different solutions, I think that has an added bonus to businesses and to consumers and helps raise awareness of the whole issue as well. So the behavioural change element was actually one of the things which has been the most positive driver of the recycling schemes. So working within the fishing communities, collaboration is key. You know, there was a problem that has been identified with fishing gear that can end up in the sea, but not dwelling on the sort of causes of that and working from a collaborative point of view to identify the challenge and then identify the potential solutions for it is absolutely key. And obviously offering the means of being able to recycle gear for free is an essential part of doing that. The fishermen have been our best advocates of this. You know, it's the fishermen that actually want these schemes in place, and we're regularly contacted by different members of the fishing community that want to be involved. We don't currently have an economic model that makes it viable at the moment without additional support, which is why the Welsh Government pilot project was really valuable to us. What we've also discovered as well, whilst working with the fishing industry, is they're then starting to advocate the recycling schemes themselves, and it's starting to have another knock-on benefit to them. So not only do they have the sort of cost savings of not having to send stuff to landfill, but it's very common, especially in trawling, that they trawl up marine plastic in general or other people's lost fishing gear. And previously there was no incentive to bring that back on land. Now, obviously, removing those cost burdens, they can bring it back, they can put it into recycling routes. And knowing that it's going to be recycled as opposed to just dumped, if there is any one that's kind of thinking along the lines of, well, if it's dumped at sea, it's not much different than being dumped on land, it sort of helps on that perception as well. So to actually help pull together all our collections, we work with Exeter City Council for the material reclamation facility. So basically their household waste facility is already perfectly equipped for being able to start processing some of our materials and assisting us in forwarding the more challenging ones. So what we have at the moment is an agreement within a 100-mile radius of Exeter that they will collect anything that comes from our beach clean groups and from our harbours within that region. And then from outside of those, we use external contractors to transport the materials to us. Once they're in Exeter, they're separated out between the different material types. So we'll separate out the gill nets, the trawl nets, the ropes, any rigid plastics. And then here's some of the on-site photos. So this is the sort of roll-on, roll-off skips that we use for doing the local collections. In and around Wales, we provided the 100-litre, 1100-litre wheelie bins and a supply of dumpy bags to stock up the materials for us. There's a load of gill nets in the top right, which are sort of prepared, stacked up, ready to be forwarded on to specialist recyclers. We recycle as much as we possibly can do in-house and in the UK, but we also use 2 European recyclers that have invested heavily in the right technology to be able to recycle the more challenging materials. And also importantly to us, they have a demand for the materials. So we know that we're not going to be a situation where we have huge stockpiles of material and no potential purchaser for them. So that's also key. But we do also recycle as much as we can in the UK, including at times some of the nets as well and ropes. But it tends to be more sort of piecemeal at the moment. We also do quite a lot of upcycling of those materials. So we've had on quite a few occasions various artists that want to be able to use some of those materials for creating installations to raise awareness. We've also worked with a theatre company that was travelling around doing the Fisherman's Friends performance, and some various forest schools that use some of the nets as cargo nets and things. So we try and sort of upcycle wherever we can as well. Here's examples of the different things that we get coming through our scheme and what we can accept and what we can't accept. Basically, a lot of the sort of rigid plastics are very recyclable to us. They're quite sort of easy wins, really. The trawl nets and ropes, gill nets, yes, all very recyclable. The challenge with them has been is finding the recyclers that can actually process them. If you put them through the traditional processing machinery that most people have in the UK, they're just too hard wearing, and the machines aren't designed to have material of that nature go through them. But they are high grade material, which can be put back into a high grade pellet form that can be then used again in manufacturing and kept as high up that supply chain as possible as far as manufacturing goes. There's certain items we don't accept. Rubber is a challenge for us. Obviously, general rubbish we can't accept into the scheme. There's some materials that can be recycled that we don't currently recycle, things like polystyrene, and that's purely because of the CO2 element of it. basically you'll be transporting air to move that material to us, and the benefit doesn't outweigh the additional CO2 that would be used in trying to transport that material. But there is technology available to be able to make that viable. So a lot of the fish boxes, etc. There are various harbours around the UK that have invested in compaction machines that will shred and compact those on site and create briquettes, and then they can be stacked on a pallet and forward, and they'll compact by up to 90% by volume, I think. So there is ways of getting some of those materials into recycling schemes. It's just not currently through us, polystyrene being one of them. Things like glass and metal are obviously highly recyclable locally, so there's no point increasing the carbon footprint of trying to move them to us. Pots and traps, they are a challenge. We are able to process some elements of it, like the whelk pots, and there tends to be big lumps of plastic materials in there, which we can process. But it's usually dismantling. That's one of the challenges, is most of the component parts of traps and pots are recyclable, but are currently not being recycled just because of the additional labour that's required to try and strip them down to all their component parts. So that's one of the challenges when it comes to recycling schemes, is actually the amount of energy that's required to prepare materials for recycling as well, which we are very reliant on the fishing industry to do. So we can recycle those components, but practically they're not usually, and they're usually not entering into recycling schemes because of the amount of effort that's required. Here's some of the examples of materials we get through on the rigid plastic front. There's quite a lot of associated plastic, things like your fish boxes and oil drums and those kind of things. So again, all highly recyclable. It helps bulk up our volume as well. So increasing volume is really key to us to be able to create those viable recycling routes. To have frequent collections, you have to work with multiple different harbours, and having harbours that are close by each other, which are having a regular supply of materials through, helps us increase the frequency of collections. Here's some examples of things that cannot be accepted. So heavily tangled up materials, things which are heavily biofouled. We have had contamination issues before with people. I think there's some shrimps there on the top right hand side that somebody's put into the recycling scheme. So anything that's too heavily degraded, I'd say probably 50% of the materials on there could be recycled, but they would require a pressure wash first, basically, before putting them into the recycling scheme. The areas where we chose to work was we tried to have a distribution along the Welsh coastline. So from Conway right the way down to Swansea. We had various stakeholders along the entire route. The types of fishing gear that we managed to collect, we ended up with 16% gill nets, 48% ropes, 20% trawl nets, and 11% rigid plastic. And here's some examples of different rigid plastic that's generated by the fishing industry. And then we've got the materials that also came in from the beach clean groups. So a lot of it on this was sort of mixed fragments of plastic, which can be recycled, but then you do have more of a challenge for sort of identifying the routes for them, because it's sometimes more challenging to actually identify the polymer types. But a lot of these materials on there are actually highly recyclable that came in. On the product innovation and design front, I won't dwell too long on this because I'm a bit conscious about time, but basically what we try and do is create products which are relevant to different stakeholders. That's, to me, is the best way of capturing people's imagination and getting them interested in the circular economy, is actually give them physical examples of things that interest them. So our first one was the kayaks, and as a cleanup group, we were using them to go out and clean all the sort of inaccessible coves in and around the southwest. And that took off as a sort of idea through, and ended up becoming the Paddle for Plastic campaign. And we ended up donating quite a lot of kayaks to different charities, as well as retailing them, to encourage people to go out there, paddle, collect the materials, get it away, get it into recycling rooms, and have that sort of best showcase of the circular economy, what it can look like. You know, you can actually create products that you can use then to go out and recover more waste. To engage more with the fishermen and the local councils, etc., we created litter bins, grip bins, creel pots, not creel pots, whelk pots, sorry, net bins, etc. And that again was the idea of creating things that are relevant. So the bottom photo is of a floating pontoon with some of our recycling bins on there for when the boats come in, they can use them as litter bins or recycling bins. They're made out of 50% fishing nets, those. And we tried to do some work with the surf industry as well. So obviously coming from the southwest, surfing's a massive thing here. Surfers quite often have the right mentality as far as marine conservation goes, that they obviously appreciate the blue space and being out in the sea and spending a lot of time in the marine environment. But the challenges they face is quite often they're on non-recyclable fiberglass boards wearing non-recyclable neoprene wetsuits. So we created the surfing hand plane, which is a small surf product that we use for body surfing, and those are made out of fishing nets and ropes. The wrist straps and the hand straps you see on them is made from recycled wetsuits. So we've tried to kind of make our innovations as relevant as possible. As far as the considerations on running schemes goes, low running costs are essential. You're trying to recycle a material which has less than no value at the end of the day, so keeping running costs as low as possible is absolutely essential in doing that. Obviously, optimizing logistics is part of that, and it also helps reduce the CO2 impacts. The key thing is it must be free for the fishing industry and beach cleaning groups. It's essential to recycle as many different types of materials as possible. We have materials that come in, we've identified up to 40 different types. 39 of those lose us money. But the important thing is to recycle as many different types as we can, and not just try and recycle the one type of fishing gear we could recycle, because then it makes it impossible for any other recycler to come in along behind us and try and recycle all the things of no value. So it's a case of trying to weigh it up to recycle as much as possible, accepting that some things will make a loss. Getting materials into recycling schemes, it's been getting more challenging over the last couple of years, because the small guys have had to either scale up or merge, and most recyclers want very large volumes of material, and the same with processors. So working on scale is really, really essential. Creating recycling routes for different grades of material is also important. So if you have different material types coming through, you can also have different grades of those materials. So some might be heavily degraded, heavily biofouled, they might be mixed nature, you might be a bit of uncertainty around what they actually are. So those sometimes you don't have any choice but to make more sort of rudimentary products with, but wherever you can, having recycling routes where you can keep that value as high up that material chain as possible to make sure it's going to be recycled again in the future is really essential. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got the routes established. We're generating quite a lot of materials, and now it's working with other partners as well to make sure that that has as greater impact as possible, and the story's being kept there for other businesses to come on board and potentially use that as well. Knowledge sharing is very important, same as collaboration. We do a lot of work with different universities, lots of different groups like this, where it's really important to have that knowledge sharing and to learn from people that are involved in the industry or involved in the ground, and having the various challenges and looking at how collaboratively you can overcome some of these hurdles. Here's some examples of different things that can be made. So really low grade stuff can go into composite type materials, it can be pressed into sheets. Ideally keep the grade up as high as possible and get it back into a pellet where it can be used in injection molding, roto molding, those kind of things. We also work with Plymouth University on the Indigo project. So that's looking at best practice within the fishing industry when it comes to fishing gear as a whole. So looking at recycling routes and what those can look like, as well as redesigning gear possibly to make them more recyclable, because one of the challenges is fishing gear is designed for durability and not recyclability. They don't always go hand in hand. You know, they're designed to withstand some incredible forces in the marine environment. It doesn't necessarily make them very easy to dismantle at the end of life. also looking at biodegradable materials, so creating an alternative to nylon for the gill nets, and obviously creating that sort of best practice framework to help kind of show others all those learnings that have come through the process. Here's some of the sustainable goals that we achieve through our business and our partners. And finally, the whole of our work is only possible through collaboration. It's a bit of a different model for a business because we are a limited company, but I started off running a charity, and that mentality is definitely carried on over to our business. You know, it's run it in the way that it is 100% reliant on other stakeholders and collaboration. And one of the key outtakes from Wales was that we need to continue and do more outreach to get to the individual fishermen on the ground and get them involved. It's challenging partly due to the nature of the fishing industry, you know, that these guys are quite often out at sea, and when they're not out at sea, they're often very busy running around as well. So it's sometimes challenging to make sure that you've reached all the members of the fishing community in your harbours, because quite often it's just the harbour master is your main point of contact. So increasing the outreach in any way, any assistance with doing that, if anyone's interested in our work or can help spread the word about our work to make sure we're reaching as many members of the fishing community as possible, it would be incredibly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Whoops. Thanks very much, Rob. That's great. And I know you're presenting to the Wales Clean Seas Partnership. I think it's next week. So more opportunity to sort of explore that a bit further. There is a report. Is that publicly available? The report that you've produced for Welsh Government?
Very soon. Basically, we've
Right.
just had the translation. We're in the process of having the Welsh translation version done, and then once we've got that version, then it will be publicly available. Yeah. Okay,
so perhaps we can make sure through this network that we sort of circulate it to people who've been involved on the call, because that will give you more detail. There are some good points in the chat which you might just want to pick up. Just conscious that we do need to sort of move on to the next session as well, but there are a couple of points in the chat about obviously the nature of the production of fishing gear itself, and you did touch on that at the end in terms of your final slides. Is there anything you just want to add in on that, Rob, before we move on?
Yeah, I think looking at the different fishing gear types and starting to bear in the end of life of the fishing gear in its design stage is important now. I think that's something that should be being factored into gear design to begin with, is how are we going to dismantle this gear at the end of its life and get it into recycling routes? Do those recycling routes exist, and what's the best way of being able to present that material?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, as I said, we have got a Wales Clean Seas Partnership next Wednesday morning. If I'll put my email in the chat, so if anybody wants to join that, which will be an opportunity to, I think it's a week Wednesday, I think, is it? We can extend the conversation with Rob then, because Rob's presenting to that network. Rob, thank you very much for that. Now we may well come back to you before the end, but I just need to move on to the next session to keep us in time. The next session is entitled Marine Treasures, and in terms of the lead into it, I think on the programme it was Alison, but is it Gareth and Sue who are picking it up? Who's introducing this session? I'm not 100% sure, having come in late to do the facilitation on this. I know it's based around a 15-minute or so video of some of the work that's been going on through the regional coordinators. Who am I passing on to? Gareth, I think, is it?
Thanks, Peter. Yes.
Yeah, there we are. Well done, Gareth.
Brilliant. Okay, so we will share a video in a very little while. It won't take me long to give a bit of preamble here. So Marine Treasures, we didn't mention this morning. We mentioned Nature and E, but this is about Nature and Byth, which is a project of 11 projects really across Wales, run by NRW, so drawing on that, collective working, and an awful lot of NGOs, RSPB doing some work on the land, and MCS, who I work for at sea. And we're doing this in partnership with Alison, who couldn't be here today, and Sue, who is on the call today. So this is the marine part of this project, and it's in this development phase. So those of you who understand how Heritage Lottery funding works, you do development phase, and if you're successful, you go through to a delivery phase. And the idea of this is to really sort of take forward some of the work from the biodiversity deep dive recommendations. Really, it's about people, it's about cross society, different stakeholders in the marine environment, and drawing on things like citizen science. So the project itself is based in both Pembrokeshire and on the Clyn Peninsula, and it's looking at restoration of 4 species in Wales. So that's native oyster, pink sea fan, spiny crowfish, and seagrass, which we heard a bit about this morning. And it's drawing on those other things about high nature, low carbon. What are the other things we can get from this, particularly in terms of native oyster? There's an opportunity there in terms of climate change. The other thing I would say is this is about restoring nature within our marine protected areas. Both the pieces of work are operating within 2 existing SACs. So again, coming back to some of the crucial things that were identified by Alice and the Minister this morning. And as we couldn't bring the sea to you, or we didn't really want to flood the botanical gardens, we produced a short video. And I say we, really it was Alison and Sue, our SAC officers as well. And this is going to take you through some of the work and actually help you see some of that. So here it is, and I'll stop talking. Thank you very much.
Hello, bore da. I'm Sue Burton, and I'm just going to take you for a quick look at the seagrass that's growing in the sea here off the village of Dale in Pembrokeshire. The seagrass off the beach was planted as part of the UK's first large-scale seagrass restoration trial by Project Seagrass Ocean Rescue in 2020. During the lowest tides of the year, you can walk out to the seagrass, but it is usually covered by shallow water. Here, before the tide comes in too much, we can peer down and see the seagrass. It can grow to about 60 centimetres in this area, longer when conditions are best for growing and the water is clear. The seagrass is currently quite sparse and patchy on the fine, muddy sand seabed. There are large areas of seaweed, much of it drifting about and attached to loose cobbles and stones. There are peacock tube worms too, that try to catch food as it wafts past. They quickly retract if disturbed. Many other animals, including crabs, sea snails and fish, live here. Seagrass can be a home to up to 30 times more animals than nearby sandy habitat. It is also an important nursery area for fish. Buoys mark out the boundary of the 2-hectare restoration zone. There are 3 visitor buoys for use by visitors to Dale Bay. The mooring buoys are here to provide a facility so that boats do not need to anchor within the seagrass, which can damage it. A local management group has created a website where users can pay a voluntary fee to use them. Signage buoys help to alert users to the area to raise awareness and help to protect it. It will take time, but we hope that the seagrass here in Dale, if undisturbed, will grow to form a dense meadow. Like this one growing at Porthincline, near the village of Mortha, Nevin, on the north coast of Penclyn. This seagrass meadow is one of the largest in North Wales. Seagrass habitats store carbon 35 times more efficiently than forests, making it really important for fighting climate change. Porthincline is a sheltered bay and boats have always moored here. But within the meadow, there are now large bald patches where the seagrass has been scrubbed away by mooring chains. Alison Hargrave has been working with boat users and designers to develop and test alternatives to traditional chain moorings. There are helical anchors, which screw into the seabed, and flexible moorings with elasticated cord. These minimise impact on the seabed surrounding the mooring. Use of new advanced mooring systems like these will help the fragmented meadow to recover. I'm in the Milford Haven Waterway, upstream of the Cladai Bridge. People come here to enjoy the calm water. It's a very different experience from the open coast, and a bit of a hidden secret. As the tide drops, it reveals more and more, and we're here to look at oysters. So here's an old oyster shell. Here's another old oyster shell. Oh, but growing on that old shell is a living oyster. There. Let's see if we can find some more. This is what we call an oyster clock. It's an empty oyster, but you've got both sides of the shell there. Oysters are bivalves, which means they have two shells. The top on the native oyster is flat, and then the bottom is curved. Oysters can grow attached things, like this one was, onto this rock. More often you might find them, and this is just obviously the shell, you'll find them just unattached. There we go, here's a live one. So here we see the nice frilly edge, and then the domed underside and the flat top. That tells you that it's the native oyster. And here, actually attached, is something that they call the oyster drill, the marine snail that can actually drill holes into and kill the oysters. This estuary is particularly special as it has rocky reef far upstream, which is unusual. It's not all mud, and that is good for oysters. These colourful red and orange patches, by the way, are sea squirts. It's a species similar to a native one, but this has come in from elsewhere and is known as an alien species. Once you get your eye in, you can soon spot oysters across the shore. But they aren't that frequent, and they're certainly not common enough to form oyster reefs or be in sufficient quantities for commercial harvesting by fishing, like they were in the past. There have been some studies in the estuary to help inform native oyster restoration, looking at the issues that need to be addressed to help boost the population. That is what we are working on. Some interventions can help the oysters that remain, and we hope that in the future we might see oysters restored to the levels that they were once at. Hello.
And that's everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. That's Sue. That was brilliant. Sue, do you want to come in? That was really professionally done. That film, brilliant film.
Thank you, Peter. It was my first attempt, and yeah, a lot of it was based on limited sort of shaky snorkel footage, not up at all to Jake's fabulous editing abilities. I've got a newfound respect for video editors because it takes a long time. But yeah, a nice, interesting thing to do, and obviously as part of Nature and Bith, which is all about engaging with people, you know, trying to show people what lives under the sea is just vitally important for our cause.
Yeah, as cameras on, sorry.
As people are saying in the chat, yeah, it felt as if you were, yeah, it felt as if you were there. No, really good film, and yeah, another good example of how that sort of thing can be sort of inspiring in terms of engagement as well. Do we want to just explore this a bit further in terms of the project and lessons coming out of it? I don't know, Gareth and Sue, do you know if this add anything in?
Go on, Sue.
Yeah,
go.
I'd just say that obviously it's a bit more difficult to show you things like the pink sea fan and the spiny crawfish, but at least most people are able to sort of at least find and look at oysters and seagrass, or at least there's more there's more potential to sort of the local communities to actually see those species. So that's why we wanted to just bring you a taster really for those two. People have generally heard about them, maybe not so much the other two species, but it's nice to that the Welsh Marine Treasures Project and Natur Ymchwil is bringing that ability to sort of showcase what we have in Wales and why it's sort of maybe in need of a bit of recovery and restoration, and what we can try and do collectively to sort of try and boost them.
Yeah, because as I said earlier, I think one of the consistent themes, over the years as we've been talking about the marine environment, is that sort of that way in which we can better engage communities in a more practical sense. It's more hidden than the land, obviously. And I know, so you've been at the forefront of trying to do that over, in terms of citizen science projects and community engagement work more broadly, and also looking at that Dale example. I think we all know that there was a really big effort in terms of community engagement around that, in terms of bringing the community on with the project, which was a really important element of introducing that project into Dale in terms of expanding the seagrass planting there.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely massive, and I think that the main sort of difference, I suppose, with terrestrial and marine conservation is that marine conservation will obviously out of sight, out of mind a little bit, but it's also that you have to work collaboratively in the marine environment, because it's not like you have a field with who the owner is and you can go and speak to them and talk about management. It's because everybody has a bit of a say in the marine environment. It's kind of open access, if you like. So yeah, you have to work collaboratively, and if you want something to succeed, then yes, you have to bring in sort of those local key holders and key stakeholders. And really talk to them. And I mean, I don't know if you can put Alison on. I don't think she's able to sort of join the audio, but maybe Adam, if you can sort of allow Alison to sort of chip in if she can, because she hasn't got that ability. She's here. She's done absolutely massive in seagrass work and other work up in North Wales as well. And a lot of that is building on the long-term relationships and trust that are built up with the local people. It takes a long time, and for instance, the Dale experience really taught us it takes a long time to introduce somebody to a marine sort of species or habitat that might not know something about, and bring them through trying to understand what it is that you want to do, what the potential benefits and impacts can be. It takes a while to earn that trust and build upon it.
Hey, Alison, you've been well trailed there, so lovely to see you. So are you able to come in, and then I'll come back to Gareth?
Hi, yeah. The only thing to add really is that we're at the beginning of this journey. It's really exciting, and echo what Sue says as well. It's all about building on everything we've all done over the last, I dread to think how long we've been at it now, Sue. about 20 odd years, I think. So it's about using all of that and just really building on it, and using those networks and making sure that there's a legacy after this as well, that it's not just a 4-year project and then it finishes. We have to make sure that it's integrated into everybody's work programs, and that it continues long into the future.
That's brilliant. Like, it does seem to me that one of the key messages coming out of this is the importance of the trusted relationship and the long-term nature of that. And one of the things that sometimes we're dogged with is the short-term funding issues that mean you have project officers that are here doing great work, and then their funding ends, and so the role finishes. So that sustained involvement of people like yourself and Sue, really important at a local level, bringing local trust with the fishing community and others in the local community. Gareth?
I mean, there isn't a great deal more I can add to what Sue and Alison said. I suppose the only other thing I would point to is, what we didn't mention in that video is water quality, which is a cross-cutting theme throughout the marine environment, and it's been talked about a lot today. So this is a really good project that shows we're working with other stakeholders, not just at sea, but also on land, and thinking about taking forward that Team Wales idea. How do we actually deliver meaningful change with buy-in from communities, but also in a joined up way? So working with people like Welsh Water and working with some of the farming community as well is going to be really important. And we heard about catchment sensitive activities as well earlier. And I think just coming back to the funding there, there's a really sort of key point here that The work itself is part funded, by donations from the different partners, and that includes Welsh Government, NRW, and then match funding from HLF. And I think going forwards, we really need to think about how we do this in a really sustainable way. We've had an announcement. There was, I think it was 3.3 million from the Minister towards some of the work that was announced today. But we need to see some of that investment come back to the marine environment. It's a very big area of Wales. It actually counts for more than half of it, but we don't see the same level of investment. And if we want to realise those benefits in terms of biodiversity restoration, but also carbon sequestration, it's got a huge role to play there. We really need to invest in that if you want to deliver these things by 2050.
Yeah, no, good point. Are there questions coming in? Any points in the chat that people want to make on this? See if Rachel, I think, is on, which is Rachel from Ceredigion and local nature partnerships. I'm just wondering, there were announcements of funding about the continuations of support for local nature partnerships. And going back to Gareth's point, I don't know, is there any potential in local nature partnerships having more of a marine dimension to their role? I'm not sure if any of the local nature partnerships do have a marine dimension to their role.
I work very closely with Anne Rogers, who's the Pembrokeshire Nature Partnership Officer, and we have done for many, many years. And obviously, we would like to sort of see it not just being so much this land and sea divide, it's coast. Marine environment is hugely influenced by terrestrial the way that we use the terrestrial environment. So it's trying not to sort of box us into land and sea. Water quality, for instance, cost us both.
Yeah, no, I think that, and that's sometimes a challenge for government funding in terms of the silo nature of departments and funding streams that make that more difficult. But I think that integrated approach in terms of local nature and engaging local communities and partnerships, both with land and sea, is an important sort of theme that we must need to keep pushing on with. Okay, any further questions? Sean's saying, Sean obviously is coordinating local nature partnerships. Closer integration required, I think, is the Sean's reinforcing that point. Okay, well, are there any other questions coming back to either Rob or Jake from the earlier sessions that I haven't been able to pick up on properly? I know that, Bob, your point, I think, was about this goes back to Rob's presentation about looking at things like crabline holders, any opportunity to include these in a single-use plastic ban. And certainly we see that down here. I'm based down in Pembrokeshire. You see that through the summer, the use of single-use plastics in terms of seaside shops. Discarded as the people go home, but particularly those crab lines who's been mentioned there. Rob, I don't know if there's any point you want to pick up on that.
So we have been involved in a couple of local conservation groups. Also have a real issue with the amount of crab lines that are being left behind, and the biggest challenge really is just the cost of them. These things are incredibly cheap, and there's numerous shops selling them, and they've done quite a lot of outreach with those shops to kind of try and persuade them into moving over to using wooden hand lines instead. And because they're more expensive to produce, the shops won't be the ones. No one is willing to sort of take that commitment in the shops to kind of be the one out of all those shops that isn't selling the plastic versions, basically. So it's coming down to their economics. So if there was some kind of additional tariff on top, then maybe that would help for sure, because let's say there is an alternative to these materials. They did set up a recycling scheme to try and help do what they could and recycle their crab lines. And last summer we had, I think it was around 9 or 10 of the large builders bulk bags just of the crab lines themselves, and that was just from one region into thousands, literally. So it is a significant problem, definitely. They've tried running schemes as well where they kind of have a couple of crab lines that people can sort of reuse to stop people from buying them from the shop. So just have them hanging up next to the harbour wall so people can use them. But there's still just too many being bought to actually have that as a sort of viable solution. So they've kind of tried to do a combination of that and running a recycling scheme. And that has been replicated in other regions, but it's not fully addressing that question, because obviously now I'm talking about the recyclability of that material, and it'd be best if that wasn't created in the first place. But it is something we can recycle.
Yeah. Good. No, thanks, Rob. Yeah, significant issue there, and again, the importance of involving local, in that case, local shopkeepers in this as well. Okay, Alison, just coming back to you. I know you've got so much experience to share, but just final thoughts. Just the point you put there in terms of land sea integration, those projects in Llinasannau.
Yeah, it's something that I'm quite keen on. This whole integration of land and sea management. I don't really think you can do one without the other. To be honest. It tends to be people that have impact, and we all live on the land. So, you know, when you look at it like that. So the two projects that I was referring to, one is called Drysorau Morol. So it took place in the Llyn Peninsula. We were looking at issues like water quality, payment for outcomes, management of coastal habitats, as well as looking at things like crawfish and otters. So that one's been very successful, and that's coming to an end now. The other one, you've probably heard of, Summit to Sea. Because of fairly obvious reasons. It's had a name change, so it's now called Canal. Huge learnings from that project, and it's a project that has turned itself around. So huge kind of learnings from that project, as in what not to do to start with. And we've now turned it around with the use of co-design and co-production. And we've recently done a big learning session on that, which we've recorded. So I will put all of that up on our website, because I do think it's quite useful, especially when it comes to community engagement, citizen science, how to get people actively involved, as part of not just discussing the issues, but as part of the solution as well. And I think with the Summit to Sea project, the interesting thing is that the people that were initially against the project and were very vocal about it now sit on the steering group and the board for the project, and they are fully immersed and invested into the project. So yeah, it is really, and this is why I was saying before, why it's so important to look at projects that have gone before and really cherry pick, you know, learn from those, learn what not to do, learn what to do, and take any resources and learning we can in moving forwards, I think.
Yeah, it's a big issue, Alison. Yeah, we go from one project to the next without really reflecting and learning and applying, so we don't build on the learning. And the Summit to Sea, yeah, is one of the classics where there's a lot of learning and a positive outcome finally going forward from it now. So yeah, good one to highlight. Rob, do you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, sorry, it's just if we'd had time, I've just noticed there was a couple of questions addressed to me that I could address in the chat, if you, or now.
Yeah, go on. If we've got a couple of minutes, yeah.
Yes, Rachel sent a message, talking about concerns about putting recycled plastic back into circulation, and the use of biodegradable materials, having a preference for those, which yeah, is a really valid point. Obviously, we're trying to create products that can be recycled long term and can keep that sort of cycle going. But in terms of the fishing industry, then a move towards biodegradability is definitely going to be important. I mean, you know, it's a very good point that actually most of these materials used to be biodegradable, and I think that's been part of the challenge with behavioural change and illegal dumping of fishing gear in the past, is that traditionally the sea had been a dumping ground of waste that was biodegradable, using hessian, hemp, wicker, willow, all these kind of products which would break down relatively quickly. But now we're finding materials, especially during the diving, we're finding materials that have been there for several decades and just not started to degrade at all. And looking at going back to using those additional things is challenging. There is a fishery that has started doing it in Brixham, Two Brothers Fishing, and they've started to use electric boats to do the very close inshore static gear using wicker creel pots. So they've sort of gone back to doing that, and they're kind of adding a premium to their catch by doing that, which is a really nice sort of success story. But generally, commercially, gear design has been moving towards larger and larger vessels and increased durability of gear. So everyone moving back to traditional materials probably wouldn't be that viable, but looking at increasing knowledge and R&D around biopolymers, so they could still have materials of the same properties they have now using biopolymers that would be then designed to degrade if they were lost in the marine environment, I think is important. And that's part of the work that's gone on through the Indigo project. There's also a question from Sue about angling line recycling, and yeah, that is something we can do. We are aware there's a national line recycling scheme, and we've got some recycling bins on one of our sites in Plymouth. Actually, we've got several of those dotted around, and the work they're doing is incredible. And we do the recycling in Plymouth of the kind of angling line through there. So it is something that could potentially be incorporated in our recycling schemes in Wales. So definitely interested in anyone wants to get involved in that or wants to follow up by email. And there's a question about pressure washing as well, why we don't we could obviously accept more materials if we did more in-house ourselves. And that just purely comes down to the economics. We just don't have the resources or the money available to be able to do it. At the end of the day, most, like I said, 39 out of the 40 products, 40 materials we recycle actually lose us money. So if we have to put in additional labour again to do more of the pre-processing, it's difficult enough to make it stack up financially as it is. So we are reliant on the extra input coming from on the ground from the fishing communities.
Rob, thanks for dealing with those questions so well. That's really helpful to take them up. Okay, we're just a minute past 3, and I think we're due to finish at 3. So I probably need to draw this to a close by thanking all the contributors: Jake, Rob, Gareth, Sue, Alison. Thank you all for joining. We'll make sure that obviously the session has been recorded. It'll be on the conference website to follow up. But I'm sure there's lots of other things you might want to follow up directly. I put my email into the chat, so if you want to drop me a note on any of it, then we can make sure we pick up your query afterwards. So thanks again all, and just to encourage you to join other parts of the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference through this week. Thank you all very much.